afternoon, church. Thank you very much first to invite me to come this afternoon to discuss high blood pressure. So, what I'd like to do is spend maybe an hour with you, or maybe 45 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end. So, I think today we had mental health, and we also had spiritual health. And now, what we really want to discuss this afternoon is physical health, and we'll be doing it by way of a type of lecture slash seminar. So, hopefully, you will find this rewarding and also informative to get lots of information. So, the topic is high blood pressure, or what we call it in the medical field is hypertension. And I just want to go through, let's call it diagnosis, treatment, uh, possible symptoms, and then look at practical application of how we might be able to manage it through lifestyle measures. But before we start that, I first want to say that we are a walking, talking miracle. Who believes that? We are walking, talking miracles. Now, I just want to prove that. So if you have a mobile phone or a calculator, I want you to do a little small exercise for me. So if you get your calculators ready, or those who are very good at maths might not need a calculator. So we have an organ in the body called a heart, yes? How many times a minute do you think the heart beats? You can guess this one. Don't need your calculator for this. How many beats per minute at rest? You think 80 to 100? Any lower, any higher? Lots of 70. Just find a middle ground. So, 70 times a minute. Yes? How many minutes in 1 hour? So times that, what did we say? 70? Times that by 60. 4,200 beats per what? Per minute or per hour? So we got 4,000 beats per hour. How many hours in a day?
Times that 1,200 by 20 hours.
What figure do we have? Repeat that. So roughly about 100,000 times our heart beats in one day. How many days in a week? Times that by 7. 700,000. Times that by 4. So then we know how much times our heart beats a month. What have we got? We're up to 2 million. That's a month. Times that by 12. How much? So our heart beats about 33 million times a year. What mechanical apparatus do you know that can beat consistently without stopping? Hold on, if our heart stops, what happens? If a car stops, what do? We push it. We bring it to the mechanic. We get it repaired. When our heart stops, but what mechanical apparatus do we know that doesn't stop, doesn't need a repair, and can continue beating for 60, 70, 80 years? Now, what mechanical apparatus, what makes them work? What gives a mechanical apparatus motion? You say fuel, electricity, power, a battery. We need a battery to operate a motor. We need electricity to turn the lights on. We need fuel for the car. What is our battery? What is our power? Where does our battery or power come from? That's why we are a walking, talking miracle. And I just needed to establish that to set the pace that all power comes from God. And what I want to do is counterbalance this now. But yet, we abuse our bodies. So I would want to just go off what Brother Herbert said earlier, and I'd want us to make a U-turn. Because even though we're a walking, talking miracle, we often insult and abuse and dismiss the fact that we're a walking, talking miracle. We often look and marvel at miracles that might have taken place. We are a miracle, but yet often we ignore it. I would go as far as saying we abuse it. So now I want to set off my presentation about high blood pressure. I can put this, can it reach here? Is that possible? Oh, okay. So just to make this very methodical or systematic, blood pressure is the pressure in your arteries. Your arteries are the vessels, like tubes, that carry blood from the heart to our brain and the rest of our bodies. So we need a certain amount of pressure for this mechanical object, this heart, to pump the body, to pump the blood around the body. And it has to be pumped, so there will be a degree of pressure. So your blood pressure naturally goes up and down throughout the day. And it's normal to do this, because sometimes we're at heightened activity, sometimes we're at moderate activity, sometimes we're sleeping. But it's when your overall blood pressure is high, especially when you're resting, is when we need to do something about it. So we expect everybody to have a certain amount of pressure, but we don't like when it's too high. So when we look at blood pressure reading, we have two readings, the upper reading and the lower reading. The upper reading is the systolic pressure, the lower reading is the diastolic pressure. When we look at the systolic pressure, it's when our heart pumps. When we look at the diastolic pressure, is when the heart is at rest. So I don't like when I see people's lower figure, the diastolic pressure, very high, because that's when the heart's meant to be at rest, not pump. That make sense? Okay. So you got blood pressure. What are the risks? Well, our arteries, to some degree, are elasticated. They have a degree of movement. And that movement helps us to cope with the variations in blood pressure, where it can be a little bit high, it can be a little bit low. But if we stretch it, if we overstretch it, then what can happen is we can lose the integrity of that vessel, and it can become weak, and it can become narrowed. When it becomes too narrow, it has the propensity to take up fatty deposits, atherosclerosis, and they can help to lower the narrowing of it's like a tube, and every tube has a lumen, an inside part. And if the tube becomes narrower and narrower and narrower and becomes weak, and then it has the ability or the capacity to take up fatty deposits, then we are damaging our vessels, and then we need more pressure to push the blood through. And if we ignore this, the risks are to the brain and to the heart. And these are the things we are trying to avoid. So if something happens to the brain, it's life-threatening. If something happens to the heart, it's life-threatening, yes? And we try to avoid that. But what we do is we walk up and down all day, skipping and jumping and having fun, taking it for granted that our heart just keeps beating. We take it for granted. And I submit that for many of us, we take it for granted to the point of abuse and ignore the potential of a life-threatening episode. So let's look at the complications. We're just going through this methodically. There will be complications to the kidneys, because if the vessels in the kidneys become narrow and weak, then the kidney has to work harder. Then you can often find that people who tend to have high blood pressure may have renal issues, kidney issues, heart failure. When the narrowing of the vessels happens sufficiently around this mechanical object, the heart, we can compromise its structure and we compromise its function. Then we can have problems with the sight because the vessels that serve the eye and the retina, if they become weak again and narrowing, we have issues with vision. And then there's vascular dementia. So vascular dementia is the blood vessels that supply oxygen and blood and nutrients to the brain can also become compromised. And if these vessels are so thin and then we have the tiniest of blood clots, we can end up with an aneurysm, a bleed on the brain. That is life-threatening. So these are some of the complications of high blood pressure, and often there are several people, in fact millions, walking up and down undiagnosed that have high blood pressure or hypertension. So what are the causes of high blood pressure? So as we increase in age, pressure rises. So over the age of 65, then we have to be a bit more sensible and careful of what we're doing. Family history. How many of you here have a family history of high blood pressure? Okay. I have a family history of high blood pressure. Both parents, who now live in the Caribbean, both suffer with hypertension, and they are both on medication. Now, I have 14 siblings. So 13 now, one passed away 2 years ago. None of the 13 children have high blood pressure. So although there is a genetic predisposition, just because you have a propensity, because of your family history, doesn't necessarily mean that you will acquire high blood pressure. Something to think about, because we often look at genetics, and somehow it can hold us captive or hostage. But you don't necessarily, if your parents are alcoholics, does that mean you will end up an alcoholic? If your parents are drug addicts, does that mean you will end up a drug addict? So although genetics is important, it doesn't dictate the future of our health. Just want to put that out there, because we use that a lot in the medical field in terms of risk. Okay, if you was a smoker or you are smoking, that's a big risk. If you're drinking too much alcohol, another big risk. But then when it comes to my speciality, diet, we often look at salt intake. So people who have too much salt, sodium, and not enough fruits and vegetables, they put themselves at risk. Now, if we think of salt or sodium, salt made up of sodium chloride, but it's the sodium part that we look at, this mineral. Now, we say people should eat at least 6 grams of salt a day. That's the kind of recommended daily allowance, 6 grams. If we was to quantify what 6 grams looks like, if you have a teaspoon and you fill it up, that's roughly 5 to 6 grams. That is the allowance of salt. But in reality, when we do all our surveys and look at research, we are eating 3 to 4 times more salt than we actually require. So this is why some of us have an issue, because what does salt do? Makes food taste nice. I think the sister was talking patience. I found it interesting when she said she's from, is it Zimbabwe? And her husband's from Nigeria. I'm trying to remember. And she said she likes the Nigerian food because it tastes nice. It made me smile because some of the reason why maybe it tastes nice is because it's loaded with salt. Because salt makes food taste nice. So she made me smile when she said that. But we are often governed, it's a harsh word to use, but by appetite. We're governed by appetite. And she said, do you remember? She likes eating the Nigerian food. So I smiled. Okay. And sometimes the salt content of the diet is often ignored, but it will raise our blood pressure. And then also, if we get insufficient exercise. So physical activity is a big thing in our world. And we're now looking at physical activity and describing it as exercise medicine. This is how we're looking at, because so many of us now are very sedentary, even though we have the capacity to engage in exercise. And also carrying too much weight is a big risk factor, especially around the central area. So we call that central obesity, or when we have too much visceral fat around the central area. Too much visceral fat around the central area can give us the potential of developing not only hypertension, high blood pressure, but also insulin resistance. That's the risk of developing diabetes, and also raising our cholesterol levels. That's the fats in the blood. So we call that the metabolic syndrome, when we carry too much fat around this area. Now, as we increase in age, it's more difficult to shed that, but it's not impossible. It's not impossible. We can make a U-turn. Okay. I have to put this slide in because this is very important. And I gave it the title, Inequalities in Health. Now, there are many places in Milton Keynes where there are high levels of deprivation. Sometimes we come to church and we look good, we're in our suits, we're in our nice dresses and shirts and hats, but sometimes we could be struggling to pay the rent, we could be struggling to pay the car note, we could be struggling to even put food on our table. And sometimes when we're struggling to put food on our table for whatever reason, that can compromise our diet and it can compromise our health. So what I often find in practice, where there is deprivation or inequalities in health, or people who are just struggling because of whether they're challenged through poverty, challenged through academia, challenged through life generally, sometimes they make choices with the diet and they go for foods that taste nice. The foods that are high in salt, high in sugar, high in fat. Given the opportunity of having chips deep fried versus oven chips, people would choose the chips deep fried. It's the fat content. It makes food taste nicer. The same with salt. If you have the option of even putting salt on your chips, I use chips for example, as opposed to not putting salt on your chips, most people go for putting salt on their chips. Why? Because nobody wants to eat dry chips. So, where there is inequalities in health, often when I'm speaking to my patients and we start talking about fruits and vegetables, they often look at me with a smirk and say, fruits and vegetables are expensive. Given the opportunity to buy in a batch of fruit and vegetables versus a packet of crisps or a portion of chips, they would tend to choose the packet of crisps or the portion of chips, where the fruits and vegetables contain so much in terms of nourishment, fiber, phytophenols, flavonoids. I could go on and on in terms of what fruits and veg contain. Antioxidants, phenols, there's so much. But given the option, sometimes when you're looking at price for price, people would prefer a bag of chips which will fill them up than fruits and vegetables which will nourish them. So, changes in your diet and increasing your physical activity will help to improve blood pressure. Secondary hypertension. So many people suffer with kidney disease. Some people suffer with diabetes. Some people suffer with a number of different health conditions. So they can often develop what we call secondary hypertension because of another condition that they present with, what we call comorbidity. So, and also people who suffer with sleep apnea. Who's come across sleep apnea? Where in the middle of the night you're waking up almost like you can't breathe. That is also a very serious condition which disturbs your sleep that can lead to secondary hypertension. But we can't ignore medications. Some medications also can lead to secondary hypertension, and some of over-the-counter herbal medicines. Sometimes we look for herbal medicines and we don't recognize that the either toxicity levels or the dosages of the herbal remedies can be harmful. So we've got to be careful of conditions that we already have that can compromise our health and lead to secondary hypertension. What are the symptoms? This is the interesting part with high blood pressure, hypertension. Most people don't know they have high blood pressure because there is not an obvious type of symptomatic profile. That's why it's so important to get your blood pressure checked regularly. Sometimes we lose our balance, vertigo, we get a sensation of dizziness. We don't know whether it's because we've been overdoing it, working too hard, tired, dehydrated, or it may be our blood pressure is too high. There are so many overlaps with symptoms that it's very hard to say to someone, I know you've got high blood pressure because of these symptoms. So really, where people sometimes have blurred vision, Could be hypertension, but it could be diabetes, true? Sometimes people have headaches or nosebleeds, and this is why you're not sure. So really the only way to really tell if you have high blood pressure or not is what? To check it. Now, I always endorse that anyone who has a family history of high blood pressure, heavy smoker, heavy drinker, poor diet, over the age of 40 or approaching it, to buy a high blood pressure machine. You can get them in most pharmacies, even on Amazon, anywhere from 15 to 21 pounds, and that can help to measure your blood pressure. Because as many as 5 million adults in the UK have undiagnosed high blood pressure and don't even know it. So they're clearly at risk. The only way to know is to measure. So I said some GP surgeries have it, some gyms have blood pressure monitors, but you can get it from pharmacies, even some workplaces now give you the opportunity to test your blood pressure. I submit that if you are 40 years old and over, you're not got a great diet, you're not really exercising, to buy a blood pressure machine and check your blood pressure periodically. Now, some people like me suffer with what we call, is it white coat syndrome? So every time I go to the GP, they say to me, your blood pressure is high. I say, it's never high when I'm at home, because I have a blood pressure machine. So they say to me, okay, do what we call a ambulatory type blood pressure, where I monitor it for 7 days, morning and afternoon, and my blood pressure is always lower when I'm not in front of a clinician. And I'm thinking, I'm not stressed, I'm not anxious, I'm fine, but the blood pressure always comes back high. But when I go home and do it, it's always a bit lower. So that's why it's good to have a machine and do it at home in a relaxed environment. Blood pressure reading. So we said there is a what? Systolic pressure and a diastolic pressure. Systolic is the what reading? The higher reading, and diastolic is the lower of the readings. For example, the reading might be something like 140 over 90. We measure blood pressure in millimeters of mercury. But in this case, we would just say 140 over 90 could be a blood pressure reading, for argument's sake. And we'll talk now about what readings represent risk. Oh, but before we do that, let's talk about diagnosis. So your blood pressure will usually need to be checked more than once to confirm a diagnosis. So we wouldn't just take one reading and say, right, you have hypertension. We'd want to take a few readings, possibly in different environments or at different times. This is because blood pressure can go up and down. If you do some vigorous exercise, you might find blood pressure could go a little bit higher. When people have their blood pressure checked in clinics, they might suffer with what I call the white coat syndrome, because you might be a little bit nervous or a little bit anxious, especially if you're being prepped for surgery. So diagnosis is important, and we take it quite seriously, because if you do present with high blood pressure, what do most doctors, clinicians, physicians, GPs want to do once you have been diagnosed with blood pressure? They want to give you medication. Now, am I against medication? Absolutely not. If it's necessary, then it's appropriate. But many people are put on medication, and then once you're on a high blood pressure type medication, you're usually on it for the rest of you usually are, unless maybe you make some serious changes to your diet and your lifestyle. And sometimes they can titrate down the frequency and the dosage of your blood pressure medication. I have known some people to come off of blood pressure medication through lifestyle intervention. But what is the most common type of medication that the GP or the physician or the cardiologist will put you on? Who knows what the name of the standard type of medication we all get put on? It's called statins. Some of you may have heard of it, some of you may not. Many people, when they're at the GP offers them statins. And sometimes the person hasn't got high blood pressure, yet they offer them statins. Sometimes the patient has maybe borderline diabetes, and they put them on statins. And it's interesting what we do in a clinic, because we have what we call algorithms. We have these statistics, and it says if you're over 40, you're a smoker, you drink alcohol, you're overweight, let's give you a statin. because statins have been shown to lower blood pressure. But many people don't like going on statins. Why do you think that is? All medication have side effects. Do you know what some of the common side effects are from statins? Headaches, tiredness, muscle weakness, dizziness, vertigo. That's just the common side effects. Then there's the uncommon side effects. Then there's the rare side effects. And they're all on the list of the pamphlet you get with the statins. So many people say they don't want to go on statins. So in a way, I can empathize with that. But as a dietitian, I know that in most cases, we can put people under what we call a 3-month lifestyle intervention to see if they really do need it. But one of the things that's really hard to overcome or to deal with when it comes to blood pressure is stress. So stress is a very important component. We never used to talk about stress so much 10, 20 years ago because it was this unknown kind of quantity. And we didn't want to go into that direction because there wasn't a great deal we could say except don't get stressed. Easy to say, hard to do. Stress can create all kinds of acrobatics in the body, creating higher blood pressure. It alters hormones, it alters chemical reactions. So because of that, I always bring up stress in my clinic to patients and say, try to look at ways of dealing with anxiety and stress. Now, patients spoke this morning about mental health. And she said mental health was well-being, mental well-being, yes? But mental illness is something completely different, true? When we look at people who are very stressed and very anxious, we tend to see high presentations of hypertension. So although that's not a dietary-related thing, I don't like to ignore it or rule it out because it's a very important factor that when you're stressed, your blood pressure can go even higher. So let's just look at the readings in a bit more detail. So normal blood pressure might be around about 90 over 60 or 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury. That's what we would look at. When you're over 80, as you increase in age, remember our arteries, the blood vessels, these tubes, they can become weaker. They lose their integrity because we're aging. And they can become weak, and then they have the capacity or the propensity to take up fatty deposits, narrowing the blood vessels even more. And the funny thing is that we develop clots from time to time, and the clot can go through the system. But when the clot is trying to go through the system, if we have a pipe, a hose pipe, and it has an obstruction, and the water's still coming through, it's still getting pumped, what happens to that hose pipe? Stretches, and it gets bigger and bigger, and the blood clot, the obstruction either passes through, or what happens to the pipe? Bursts, yes? All right. So, when you think of blood clots, especially in very narrow vessels, especially in the brain, where they're weak, they've lost their elasticity, they've lost their strength and their integrity, the clot in the brain will create enough pressure to burst that vessel, hemorrhage, aneurysm. That's a very serious, life-threatening condition that we often would call a cerebral vascular accident or stroke. Many people survive from a stroke, but some people die from a stroke. Often those who survive from the stroke end up living a very debilitating life where they've got poor mobility. So that's what we're trying to avoid. When we now look at high blood pressure, it's usually, so normal blood pressure considered to be 120 over 80, but when our levels are higher, I need to go to the next one, then we look at the different stages. So often when I go to the GP, they say I have stage 1 hypertension. But it's not surprising because I'm 60 years old. So you'd expect maybe my pressure's a bit higher. All my brothers and sisters who are older than me, no one has high blood pressure. So it's interesting. But stage 1 means what? If you've been told you have stage 1 high blood pressure, what are you going to do about it? Hopefully something, yes? What I want to say here without being controversial is some of us, when we have high blood pressure, we wish we could change. Some of us want to change, but then there's some of us that make it happen. Are you one of those that makes things happen? When you have an illness, a health-related condition, is it the responsibility of your parents to encourage you to do something about it? Yes or no? Is it the responsibility of your wife or your husband to tell you to do something about it? Is it the responsibility of your brother or your sister to tell you to do something about it? Is it the responsibility of your children to beg you to do something about it? We are accountable for this walking, talking miracle that we possess that belongs to God. So something to think about. When we get to stage 3 hypertension, the systolic pressure, the higher figure, is over 180, and the diastolic pressure is over 120. If you have blood pressure at 180 over 120, you need to do something about it. If the GP is not open, you need to go to A&E so they can check you out, and they may put you on medication straight away to try and treat the acute condition to avoid heart failure or to avoid a stroke. Does it sound like I'm being a bit dramatic here? I don't know. Maybe I am. I don't know. But it's a serious condition, yes? Okay. Treatment. Right. How your blood pressure is managed depends on a range of things, such as your health, your age, and the stage of your condition. It could be stage 3. In the absence of medication, dietitians always promote or endorse lifestyle intervention first to help to lower blood pressure. Recent evidence shows that tackling obesity, particularly when you're carrying too much weight, and staying active are really important modalities. You feel the benefits almost instantly, because when we exercise, it raises something called endorphins, hormones that make us feel good, can help to relax us and decrease stress. That's the beauty and the value of exercise. But it can also help to improve your sleep and increase your energy levels as well, just by bringing a bit of weight down and exercising a little bit more. And I said I was going to talk about some practical applications around this. So the dietary measures. Now, it's always or often difficult for you to go away with a lot of information around what you could do. And I have some information sheets here that can help. I think I have an information sheet on weight loss, one information sheet on physical activity, another one on what represents a really low-calorie diet, and also one on the DASH diet. And I'll talk a little bit about the DASH diet in a little while. But if there were only 3 things that I would ask you to do based on this presentation, if we was to look at managing hypertension, it would be to reduce salt. So a question to the class. What is the daily recommended allowance for salt per day? How much salt are we actually having in practice? About 18 grams. Reduce salt. Don't use salt at the table. If you can reduce it even further in cooking, that would be even more valuable. Many of the foods that we eat, if they're not made from fresh, they're either going to be processed or ready-made. The reason why we go back for the processed foods or the ready-made foods is because they're high in. So salt is a big thing. Reduce salt as an immediate measure to help to bring down your blood pressure. This is for the general public, this presentation, and sometimes for my university students. But if you drink alcohol, avoid alcohol consumption. Not only does alcohol raise blood pressure, but it's what we would call a class 1 carcinogen, developing risk of cancerous cells. The third thing I would say is introduce a healthy, balanced diet. Now, we'll talk about what a healthy, balanced diet represents in a while. Now let's talk about it now. So, if we was to break it down in terms of maybe 7 areas, adults should have no more than 6 grams of salt per day, lower if possible. A diet that includes foods high in potassium, magnesium, calcium, and fiber. Tell me what you think, what does a diet look like that's high in potassium, magnesium, calcium, and fiber? What if you was to give that type of diet a name, what might you call that? A plant-based diet, absolutely. I can't stress enough the importance of plant-based diets. When I look at research, and I have to look at research all the time, as dietitians, we're bound by a code of conduct. That code of conduct says that we have to only give information that is based on strong evidence. If it hasn't got strong evidence, we don't promote it. The evidence is overwhelming on the value and the power and the protectiveness of a plant-based diet. When I was in university in 1996 at the, what do we call it then, the Polytechnic of North London, I think it's called a Met now, Holloway Road. I used to be in a lecture with 200 other students, and the lecturer at the front used to talk about diets and plant-based diets. And they used to say there are different groups around the world who live longer as a result of following plant-based diets. Then they would mention a few Chinese communities, a few other communities. Then they would mention Seventh-day Adventists, and my eyes would pop up because I was a Seventh-day Adventist. And they would say, yes, we've done research in Linda Loma, this place, that place, and we've looked at Adventists, and we've looked at all different ages. They live longer, less heart disease, less strokes, less development of cancer. Now, do Seventh-day Adventists get cancer? Of course they do. Do Seventh-day Adventists end up with heart failure or strokes? Of course they do. But they were saying through a plant-based diet, Seventh-day Adventists, which included me, have a much more protective power. You were talking about power earlier on. They have a protective power as a result of their plant-based diet. They also spoke about their lifestyle. They said all Seventh-day Adventists, this is the lecturer at the front, a little German lady, saying all Adventists don't drink alcohol. But we don't, is that true? Some do. So all Adventists don't eat meat. I remember you said earlier, you've got some pastors, they have their hand in their pocket and they say, I will eat meat until the day I die. I recall you saying that. So, but when she was saying this, I did not challenge her because all the other students are listening. And in their mind, Adventists don't drink alcohol, they don't eat meat, they don't smoke, they exercise, and they all live longer. Everybody wants to live longer. So everybody was influenced by these studies. These studies have lasted the test of time. Plant-based diets. So whole grain foods, so cereals, going for the whole grain version, breads, the whole grain version, pasta. Who in here likes brown pasta? Some do, many don't. Who in here likes brown rice? Some do, many don't. But I'll tell you this, when you are used to having white pasta and you first start to eat brown pasta, it tastes like cardboard. When you first start to eat it. After a few months, you come habituated to the taste. Is that true or is that a lie for those that eat brown pasta? Right. When you eat white rice, you like white rice. It's more processed. When you eat brown rice or brown basmati rice, at first it tastes like cardboard. Then you get used to it. So going for the higher fiber, the more whole grain versions are much more beneficial. They're higher in potassium, magnesium, calcium, fiber, all the phytonutrients. So go for the whole grain versions. Then, of course, you've got the omega-3 or the omega fats. Now, our bodies cannot make these essential fats, but these essential fats are important in terms of heart health, brain health. We're even finding out now gut health, the omega-3, 6, and 9s. Many people will get the omega fats from oily fish. But as vegetarians or vegans or those following a plant-based diet, you've got nuts and seeds. They will give you your balance of essential free fatty acids. Then, of course, we have the DASH diet. So for many years now, we have been promoting the DASH diet for people who have hypertension. And the DASH diet focuses on, to some extent, a plant-based diet. And I have a copy of what the DASH diet might look like in a summary form for those that would like to have a look at it. The DASH diet focuses on vegetables, fruits, and whole grains. It includes fat-free or low-fat dairy products, does contain fish, poultry, beans, lean versions of the fish and poultry, and nuts and seeds. The diet limits foods that are high in salt, also called sodium. It also limits added sugar and saturated fat, such as in fatty meats and in full-fat dairy products. It was interesting you mentioned about the tripe earlier, and it's interesting because I never did, when I was little, I wasn't a Seventh-day Adventist, so my mum used to buy tripe. This is the interesting thing. When you move from, let's say, a developing country or island, from the West Indies to the UK, often our parents who were struggling to get work, and even now when people migrate, you're struggling to get work, struggling to get education, you're struggling with houses, you're going to buy food, which is what? So we would have corned beef. We would have, what is it? Is it pig trotters? We would have tripe, offal, all the foods that are high in fat, trans fats, high in salt, that are no good for you. But that is what we could afford. But because that's all we could afford, as the children, we become habituated to those foods. Often you'd find us as the children at the fridge with the can of condensed milk, drinking it like this, until we got caught. Because these are the foods that have the nicest taste and they're cheap to buy. When we look at the DASH diet, it's telling us to change our eating habits. All of us have a cultural context, but which is more powerful, the cultural context or the spiritual context? So we have to think about this, because culture plays a role in forming who we are. We are the sum of everything that we've experienced, but some of what we have experienced is counterproductive and damaging. But we wouldn't have known. But now that we know, we can make a difference. Yes? All right. If we look at the DASH diet and we focus on it a bit more, we're looking at 7 to 8 portions of whole grains a day, 4 to 5 portions of fruit and veg a day, 4 to 5 portions of vegetables a day, 2 to 3 portions of low-fat dairy products, or even the plant-based type products like the soya-based, the almond-based, the oat-based, the rice-based. 2 portions or less of lean protein, or that could be in the form of plant proteins, pulses, beans, lentils. Nuts also 4 to 5 times a week, and reduced salt. This essentially is what the DASH diet looks like. I am much more in favor, though, of a low-salt, plant-based diet. That's what I try to promote with my patients. Do I force it on them? No. All I do is try to give them the evidence to demonstrate the merits of such a diet. And then we make the choice. Because who is accountable? Is it our parents? We are accountable for our own health. So don't forget, I think this is the end. Don't forget, physical activity. Now, I'm not a physiotherapist by background, but I work with physiotherapists. I think exercise is fundamental, and earlier I called it exercise medicine. Many of us might be immobile, or we can't exercise, or maybe we have difficulty walking. If you have difficulty walking, use an armchair and do upper body exercises. Try not to ignore the value of exercise. If you struggle with arthritis or hips or knees or ankles, find your nearest swimming pool and do some sort of water type exercise to help to get the exercise up. The government, the UK government, or is it Department of Health, recommend 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity a day. So we've been sitting down a long time. Can I get you to stand up a minute? I want to show you what moderate intensity looks like. So for those of you who can, just walk on the spot for me. When you're walking on the spot, you should be able to talk. If you're able to sing, you're not walking hard enough, but you should be able to talk. Your heart should be beating a little bit faster. You should feel that maybe breaking out into a little bit of a sweat, and maybe you should be breathing a bit heavier. Okay, you can relax. That is moderate intensity, because you have low intensity, which is sedentary. You have high intensity. So we don't want you to do high intensity exercise, because that can have some risk in itself in terms of torn ligaments and stretched muscles, etc., etc. But moderate intensity exercise. Some people carry, what do you call them again? A pedometer. Some people carry a pedometer, or they have it on their watch, and we often say, try to do about 10,000 steps a day. On average, when you look at the research, most people do about 6,000 steps a day. I was quite intrigued with this about 6 or 7 years ago. I was managing the dietitians at Milton Keynes Hospital, and I was intrigued about how many steps we all do. So I gave everybody a pedometer. I think it was who was it? Kellogg's, compliments of Kellogg's. Anyway, we got loads of pedometers that I was giving out to patients for weight loss classes. So we all had pedometers and was testing it. And to my surprise, I thought I was very active, walking up and down the wards all day long. And when I looked at the end of the day, my average over a week was only 6,000 steps a day. And I was thinking I was way exceeding that. So 10,000 steps is what we say is a good level to aim for. But if you're carrying too much weight or you've got high blood pressure, I tell people to go higher than 10,000 steps. I had someone the other day and I was trying to give them some advice, and I was thinking they was very inactive. And they said to me they'd do 20,000 steps a day. I was very impressed, because that's high level. So trying to stay active, 150 minutes is like 30 minutes a day for 5 days a week. Now, if you're not used to doing exercise, I normally say to people, at least start off with 3 episodes of exercise, minimum 3 episodes of exercise. And if you can't do 30 minutes each episode, 10 minutes is enough, and build up slowly. You'll develop your strength, your grip, your fitness. All this will develop. Your heart rate, your breathing, everything will improve if you maintain consistency. Continuity is the key. So many people line up and get gym subscriptions in January. By March, the gym subscription is in the back of the drawer, and they're not attending the gym anymore. So if you can just manage just 3 episodes and try to work up to 30 minutes, whether you're doing armchair exercises, and do an exercise you enjoy. Not everyone likes to go to the gym. Not everyone likes to do exercise on their own. Not everyone wants to go jogging or compete for the next marathon. But if you could find something you enjoy, even dancing, something you can enjoy, try to maintain it and do it with consistency. But 150 minutes is the goal to try and achieve for exercise. Getting good sleep. It's easy to tell someone to get good sleep, but in practice it's harder if your brain is overthinking. And if your brain is overthinking and you can't sleep very good, the risk of high blood pressure is higher. Get rid of stress. Now, I see people with stress quite a lot. In all my clinics, with every patient, I always ask about stress now, because people have stress from work, some people have stress from their partners, some people have stress from their neighbors, some people have stress from their children. Stress is all around us. Would you agree? But not all of us are very good at dealing and coping with stress, and I think patients mentioned that. I think she said sometimes you can come into your house and your house is upside down. Probably your kids could have been turning the place upside down. You walk in, you see it, you have a meltdown, you start screaming and shouting, you get stressed, and you go and lie down and pull the covers over your head. So that's not coping with stress. She said coping with stress might be to see it, to reflect, to analyze, then to clear it up, to relieve the stress and the anxiety. Coping with stress is important. When you cannot cope with stress, I refer people to a therapist. I do. I tell people to go online and look at ways of how you can reduce anxiety and stress. It could be cognitive behavioral therapy, where you learn ways of coping with anxiety or stressful situations. Dealing with stress is fundamental, not just for high blood pressure, for every comorbidity, for every medical condition you have. The last thing you want to do is have a stressful lifestyle, because when you have a stressful lifestyle, the body will automatically develop a response, which is inflammation. Do you remember I said we're a walking, talking miracle? The inflammation response is necessary to protect the body. That's why you get the inflammation response. But if you have the inflammation response and it lasts long and it's too high, it will damage cells. So stress is important to try and relieve. And of course, maintain a healthy weight. And again, by diet and exercise. So, I think this is my final slide. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own, you were bought at a price. 1 Corinthians 6:19-20. Therefore, my final statement, honor and glorify God with your body. Okay, thank you. I think we may have time for questions. Or yes? Okay. Sorry, I'm ready to take a few questions. Yes, sir. Do we need someone with a mic or not? Or we can project your voice? Okay. You're testing my memory now. Go on. Third point. Okay. Sure. Okay, so let's deal with them one by one. So, with the first question, taking the blood pressure readings at, let's call it unrealistic times, I always say to patients, the reason why they would request that at those particular times is because they want it at those times and to you to maintain that for maybe 5 or 6 or 7 days at that time for continuity, consistency. So it's a systematic approach. But as a patient, there is no reason why you cannot be vocal. I want to make this point and stress to the clinician that this is unrealistic for your lifestyle. And can you use another time or timing to take those blood pressure readings? The important thing with the readings is that they are at the same time every day. So there's consistency, or we call that it's systematic. So I say be vocal when they're asking you to follow a certain protocol. There's no reason why you can't speak up. We have a history sometimes of not speaking up. But I think the younger people nowadays, they don't mind speaking up. But be vocal. That's the first thing, to adjust the timings to suit your lifestyle. That's the first question. Answer. The second one was black people. And why black people have a high blood pressure? It's an epidemic almost. Now, I looked into this many, many years ago because I was trying to find the answer myself, saying people who live in deprivation, but when you look at even Americans, African Americans Africans, Afro-Caribbeans, irrespective of what part of the geography of the world they are. So I started looking into it. I was trying to wonder why. Some say genetics, some say, what's the other thing? There's a number of different things. What I found interesting, and you don't have to agree with me, but this is what I found interesting in research. Black people, over the centuries, have been exposed to a great deal of stressors. Racism is one of them. Now, some of my counterparts and colleagues, they would challenge me with that, but I've looked it up. And if you look at African Americans, if you look at Afro-Caribbeans, even if you look at people in Africa, and then you start looking at lifestyles and levels of stress and how the rest of the world or their environment, what they impose on them,